Welcome back to another explainer. So today we are looking at Galena, the town that rivaled Chicago. Now, when we think of massive economic power in the Midwest, our minds literally immediately jump to the towering skyscrapers of the Windy City, right? But what if I told you there once was a small, unassuming town in Illinois that was actually richer and way more influential than Chicago? I know, it sounds absolutely impossible today, but back in the 1840s, this quiet little town was actually the economic powerhouse of the entire region.
Okay, let's dive into this. What if a tiny town of just 3,300 people once completely outpowered Chicago? I want you to travel back in time with me right about 180 years ago to the 1840s. Instead of the quiet, beautiful historic place that it is today, just imagine a town absolutely booming with money, endless business, and nonstop opportunity. The name of this place? Galena. And honestly, the most fascinating part of this whole story is that the secret to its massive wealth wasn't hidden away in bank vaults. No, it was hidden deep underground.
Section 1. The Black Gold Boom. Unearthing Galena's Secret Wealth.
In the early 1800s, thousands of eager miners and sharp businessmen just flooded into Galena, all hoping to strike it rich. But they weren't looking for standard gold. Actually, scratch that. They were looking for something entirely different that turned Galena into one of the biggest mining centers in all of America. Which brings up a really crucial question. Why lead? Seriously, why was this specific, kind of boring gray metal causing thousands of people to just uproot their entire lives and move to rural Illinois?
Well, and this brilliantly illustrates the point. In the 1800s, lead was basically the foundational building block of the American economy. We are talking bullets, water pipes, heavy construction materials, and all sorts of vital industrial products. The sheer overwhelming demand for these items transformed Galena almost instantly. Because they had the lead, they literally held the power. We're talking steamboats filling the river ports every single day to transport this stuff. Merchants were making absolute fortunes practically overnight, and the town began to really reflect that wealth, Sprawling luxury homes, grand hotels, and massive banks popping up on practically every single corner.
Section 2. Galena versus Chicago, a tale of two cities.
It is just a sheer, fascinating irony that while Chicago was basically still in its muddy early developmental stages, Galena was just overflowing with elite trade money. In fact, historians at the time didn't just think Galena was mildly important. They literally called it the city that could have become the next Chicago. Let that sink in. That is how incredibly powerful and influential Galena was in the 1840s. They weren't just participating in the Midwestern economy. They were running the whole show.
But well, history had a very different plan. You see, the 1840s really represented Galena's absolute peak in wealth. But as we move into the 1850s, the very industry that built the town, those underground lead mines, began to collapse. The veins became way less productive, and profits just started to drastically drop. And then, the real fatal blow lands in the 1860s. Because while Galena is struggling with these empty mines, Chicago experiences this massive transportation revolution. Slowly but surely, the businesses and the population packed up and moved away from the fading mines and headed straight toward the bustling new railroad hub.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the survival strategies of these two towns couldn't have been more different. Galena completely relied on steamboats and those underground lead mines, while Chicago heavily and strategically invested in above-ground railroads and modern transportation. Chicago used its strategic location to expand rapidly, basically adapting to the future, right? While Galena was physically stuck. That strategic transportation shift is exactly how Chicago eventually took the lead to become one of the largest cities in America.
Which brings us to Section 3, the City of Generals, Shaping a Nation.
Now, the story definitely doesn't end with an economic collapse, because Galena's legacy is also deeply about its people. 9. That is the staggering number of Civil War generals who once called this small town home. Just pause and think about that concentration of leadership for a second. Most people have absolutely no idea about this, but for a town of its modest size to produce 9 generals who would go on to shape the entire trajectory of the United States, that's just fascinating.
And for sure, the most famous of those 9 is none other than Ulysses S. Grant, from a humble leather worker to a celebrated U.S. president. Before he was a national war hero, Grant lived a very quiet, super humble life right there in Galena, just working in his family's leather store. And today, you can actually still visit his home. It remains one of the town's absolute biggest tourist attractions. It really stands as this tangible, physical reminder of the historical leadership that grew right out of this tiny, rugged mining hub.
Let's move to Section 4, a living time capsule, the ultimate silver lining. You know, the most beautiful irony of this entire story is that Galena's quote-unquote failure to become a giant modern metropolis actually saved it. So the crucial point is, today an incredible 62% of the entire town is part of a national historic district. Unlike those major cities that destroy their past to build the future, Galena is a completely preserved time capsule. Walking through those streets today, right past the old brick buildings and untouched vintage architecture, it literally feels exactly like stepping back into the 19th century. They somehow managed to keep their history completely alive.
It's just a tiny place with a massive, world-changing story. And it leaves us with this final, really thought-provoking question. Is being a living piece of history more fascinating than being famous forever? So the next time you think of powerful American cities, I hope you remember this hidden gem that once stood high above Chicago itself. Thanks so much for walking through this explainer with me. I really hope you found this slice of history as fascinating as I did.